I will once again switch over to English, since our next guest is joining us from London, United Kingdom. He's a prominent voice to the left within the Labour movement and the British political debate. He's an author, he's a journalist, he's a columnist, he's a broadcaster, he's an activist. Please welcome to the stage, with a warm round of applause, Owen Jones.
Well, firstly, thank you so much. It's an honour to be here in Sweden. Obviously, this is a day of acute emotional trauma for me, here discussing the intricacies of global politics, rather than on my hands and knees sobbing with uncontrollable joy as I celebrate the coronation of my beloved king. I hope you understand just how much of a sacrifice this is, rather than worshipping at the feet of King Charles III. Here I am. So it's an honor to be able to talk about the right, defeating the right, and what we do about it. And what I'm going to do first of all is talk about, I suppose, very clear, as I see it, to paint in technicolor how bankrupt the economic and social order is which prevails in much of the global north, and how it's failed on two counts. Firstly, on its own terms, in terms of the promises that it made, and secondly, in its inability to meet the needs of the wider population. Now, in recent years, one of the defining narratives of the right has been this idea of the decline of the West. For the right, this is a moral tale, that the traditional culture and values of the West, as they see it, are under assault because of the movements representing the rights of marginalized minorities, which they believe represent moral decay, because of multiculturalism and immigration, and because of a reassessment of European history, which seeks to acknowledge and understand the crimes committed by the global north, not least to better understand contemporary injustices like racism. Now, the right's counterattack against these trends has become known as the culture war. The culture war suits them well because it sucks the oxygen out of any other political conversation, specifically deflecting from economic ills and social grievances. When we're discussing boats arriving on our shores containing some of the world's most desperate people, or debating people's genitals, which has become one of the main political issues in British politics, I kid you not, we are not discussing stagnating living standards, the housing crisis, or the destruction of the public realm. But there is some truth in the decline of the West, just not in the ways described by the right. If there is such a thing as the onward march of human progress, it has not just halted, but screeched into reverse. Last autumn, a little discussed report by the United Nations noted that human development had declined in 90% of countries for 2 years in a row, a fall without precedent for more than 3 decades. The pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine played their role, but so too, according to the United Nations, did sweeping social and economic shifts, dangerous planetary changes, and massive increases in political and social polarization. The turnaround in our collective fortunes has been dramatic, but it's driven by an economic system that has promised personal freedom, but has instead delivered insecurity on a mass scale, and which has hurt us in every conceivable way, from our emotional and physical well-being to our material circumstances. So take one basic measure, life and death. The British government was recently forced to delay increasing the state pension age after a fall in life expectancy without precedent since the Nazis were bombing the UK mainland. Although certainly worsened by the pandemic, life expectancy was already declining in communities across England before COVID arrived on our shores. In the US, life expectancy declined from nearly 79 in 2019 to 76 just 2 years later, the biggest fall since the 1920s. And the morbid symptoms of a crisis in well-being are everywhere. Across the Atlantic, the suicide rate soared by 30% in the first 20 years of the 21st century. As the war on drugs has escalated, so too have deaths from substance abuse in the US. they've grown exponentially since the 1970s, one of the main reasons life expectancy is falling in the United States, in large part caused not by older people not living as long, but by younger adults dying. While in UK, that's reached, in terms of drug deaths, the highest levels since records began. Now, Karl Marx once described religion as the sigh of an oppressed creature. Today, this is more of an apt description of drug addiction, driven by the self-medication of those afflicted by trauma and misery. Indeed, it's difficult to disentangle from a surge in rates of depression around the world, which increased by nearly a fifth between 2005 and 2015, and has also surged amongst US teenagers. Now, peering at the rubble left by humanity's bloodiest war, the best part of a century ago, a Western European citizen in 1945 would have been pleasantly surprised to discover that the most prosperous years in human history awaited them. Such was the unprecedented rise in living standards in the West in the 3 decades after the war that it became christened the Golden Age, for the French, the 30 glorious years. But while the UK suffered a particularly pronounced fall in wages in the 2010s, they've stagnated across the Western world. Before the pandemic hit, the purchasing power of US workers had barely shifted for 4 decades. Now, it's easy to be lulled into the illusion that dramatic progress is still happening. Computer chips get ever smaller, computer processors ever faster, mobile phones ever more dynamic. But technological advancement does not automatically translate into improvements for the human condition. Across much of the West, stagnation and decline have become defining features of our age. If you want to understand why politics is more angry and more polarized, it's not, as some would say, due to social media, for example, fueling argumentative behavior. A grand experiment has been underway for more than a generation. What if you cut off optimism from rich societies that previously took ever-rising living standards for granted? Now, the rise of the free market, we were promised, would unleash endless prosperity. But while the much demonized age of strong trade unions, nationalization, and expansive welfare states delivered the greatest improvement in living standards in history, our current economic model is decomposing all around us, and the stench is becoming harder to ignore. On both sides of the Atlantic, economic growth has fallen since the frontiers of the state were rolled back, and that more limited growth is much more likely to be sucked into the bank accounts of the gilded rich. In countries like the US and Britain, the 1960s was the decade in which we had the greatest economic growth. Not something you can attribute to post-war reconstruction. The Western European economies had recovered by the early 1950s, and that greater growth was more equitably distributed. In Britain, since the Thatcherite experiment, which I'll talk about, economic growth has shrunk and is less equitably distributed. Now, when we describe falling life expectancy, we know, not just if talking about the rise of opiate use, for example, in the US, we know that the disappearance of secure and well-paid jobs has bred the conditions of misery in which addiction thrives. Growing inequality has helped spur on deteriorating mental health. Rates of depression correlate with low income, for example. From the generational collapse in public housing to the decimation of social care, the security that underpins a comfortable human existence has been peeled away in many of these societies. Now, if we think about, I talked about this cost of living crisis, the cost of living crisis which afflicts British society. It's difficult to explain how profound that's been. And if we talk about the chaos, the great chaos that Britain has had in the last few years, you can't understand it without the most important statistic of all, which is that in Britain we've had the longest squeeze in wages now since the Battle of Waterloo, since the Napoleonic age. The average worker in Britain in 2026 is projected to be poorer on average than they were in 2008. In 2010, the average Briton was as well off as the average German, but now the average Briton is 16% poorer. In Britain, we have a housing crisis, which is a fascinating and disturbing and chilling insight into this grand experiment where the government abdicates its responsibility on one of the most basic needs of all, a house. So in the 1980s, social housing, council housing, was flogged off and privatized without the stock being replaced, with no consideration, of course, about where the next generation was supposed to live. 40% of that housing taken over by private landlords, charging twice the rent that existed before, where you have home ownership collapsing amongst younger adults, but a private rented sector where they're driven in instead, defined by extortionate rents, where many young workers are paying half of their pay packet on their rent alone, paying somebody else's mortgage, with an unregulated system where they can be evicted at very short notice indeed. Where you have a society defined by job insecurity. It used to be the case in Britain that dock workers would turn up to the dockyard in the morning and stick their hands up, hoping to get work, often to go home disappointed. Today, that is the lot of the so-called zero-hour worker who has no hours allotted in their contracts, who often don't know day to day how many hours, if any, they will have, let alone week for week, unable to plan their lives, to know how much income they'll have from day to week, and so on. We've seen the decimation of funding of education. We've seen in Britain the consequences of indebting a generation for daring to dream to a university education, a social good from which all of society benefits. The average student now facing £55,000 of student debt as a consequence. All of this is what has driven the British political chaos, if you like. And British exceptionalism always tried to present Britain as somehow this oasis of calm compared to its turbulent and chaotic European nations. But now, to many people, Britain resembles a drunk guy at a pub who's just swinging his fists around, trying to fight everyone without realizing that he's soiled himself. Now, this is the chaos, the great chaos that has been driven by the economic and social turmoil of a broken social order. So what we see in Britain at the moment isn't simply a story of a political party which has been in power for too long, for the last 13 years, the Conservatives, but the morbid symptoms of a social and economic order which is in meltdown. Now, it's interesting because you probably noticed we had quite a few prime ministers and people began to forget who was actually in charge of the country for a while. When Boris Johnson was forced to resign after it was found that people in Britain couldn't hold the hands of their dying relatives, people had to watch during the pandemic as I did, their relatives buried on Zoom, that those who governed us were partying in number 10 to such an extent that they were so drunk they were vomiting in bins, that they were singing karaoke, and then lied about it and was forced to resign. And Liz Truss took over and tried to impose what could only be described as a completely unhinged right-wing economic agenda, which caused the pound to collapse, which caused the bond markets to be thrown into chaos, which caused the pension funds to nearly collapse, and which drove up mortgages. All in all, a truly great success. Now, Liz Truss lasted only a few weeks in office, but what's interesting is she had an analysis which understood that our economic order is in crisis, but whilst trying to double down on the actual causes. Now, what they were doing is working to a blueprint which was first devised in the Hôtel du Parc of Montpellier, a sleepy Swiss village, back in 1947. And amongst those who gathered there were the economists Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman and the philosopher Karl Popper. And they were profoundly depressed. At the time, they said the central values of civilization are in danger, caused, they said, by a decline of belief in private property and the competitive market after the Great Depression and the World Wars. And they fleshed out a belief that the state and collectivism were mortal threats to the individual's ability to succeed. That Margaret Thatcher, of course, was the would-be torchbearer that Liz Truss sought to follow with zeal. Now, the neoliberals, as they became known, used the political exile of the first 30 years after World War II wisely. They went on to found think tanks such as the Institute of Economic Affairs, to lay the Heritage Foundation in the United States, to lay the intellectual foundations and find funders. But these ideologues, what they really needed was turmoil. Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change, as Milton Friedman observed. When the crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas lying around. Now, of course, in a foreshadowing of what's happened today, the surging inflation of the 1970s, back then spurred on by a massive oil shock, offered that opportunity. In Britain, unions went on strike to defend falling wages, and Thatcher cleverly wove a story of individual effort stifled by the state. We believe that everyone has the right to be unequal, she declared, arguing that while ordinary workers were crucial to society, there were others with special gifts who should also have their chance. That meant in practice slashing taxes on the rich, flogging off state assets, and crushing trade unions in the name of individual liberty. Now, in the eyes of Liz Truss, our doomed Prime Minister, Thatcher's prescriptions had freed Britain from the corset of socialism and ushered in a new age of prosperity. And so a return to her vision would end the same way. Now, this was all based on a myth. In Britain, we had the discovery of North Sea oil in the 80s, and unlike Norway, which used that to build a grand sovereign fund, it was frittered away in order to prop up the disastrous policies of Margaret Thatcher. Now, it's striking that one rare defender of our current Prime Minister, prominent this Institute of Economic Affairs, which has basically transformed Britain very successfully. They laid the intellectual foundations for what happened, screeched that Liz Truss needed to stay the course, claiming that Thatcherism was savaged in its day, but it paved the way for the growth of the following decade. But as I've said, what's so striking is the dismal economic failure of Britain ever since. That the 1980s had the same economic growth on average as the much despised 1970s, but it was less equitably distributed. In the 1990s, average growth fell again. In the 2000s, it fell again, and in the 2010s was virtually the same. A disastrous period of stagnation since Thatcherism, but the proceeds of that stagnation ever less equitably distributed. So less growth, but that growth ending up in the pockets of a tiny elite. The legacy of Thatcherism was an economy too dependent on the City of London, communities stripped of work, creaking infrastructure and public services. This is the consequences of this grand doomed experiment, which in part, interestingly, ended up repudiated by our current Prime Minister, a very right-wing conservative Rishi Sunak. For example, the mantra of the right was that you keep cutting taxes and it will pay for itself. So under the Conservative government of the 13 years, they cut corporation tax over and over and over again until it's just been reversed. The current government's increasing corporation tax. According to Rishi Sunak, he said that low corporation tax rate has done absolutely nothing for investment in our economy. It has not increased. It's one of the lowest in the developed world. So that grand experiment is even partly repudiated by its own ideologues. Now, in terms of where the left fits into all of this, I think it's interesting that what's happened in 2008 was this nuclear explosion detonated within neoliberalism. We had the financial crash. And there was a bit of, I think, amongst the scattered remnants of the left at the time, a sense that we'd been vindicated, that this showed that neoliberalism was doomed, and that now the time would come for the left, with a self-evident failure of that system. But of course, it goes back to what Milton Friedman said, that crisis is a precondition for change, but it depends on the ideas lying around, and indeed the movements. And in 2008, the left was shattered. We'd suffered generational defeats, and we were in a defensive posture, defined by what we were against rather than what we were for. Stop the cuts, stop privatization, stop the war, and stop the world I want to get off. But what we didn't have was a coherent vision of society. So from 2001, austerity was imposed across Europe and Britain and elsewhere. And that vacuum of disillusionment was often filled by right-wing populist movements who told a very simple and straightforward story, that the problems you face, your lack of jobs, your falling wages, your lack of housing, your deteriorating public services, are caused by immigrants and migrants caused by refugees, caused by some of the most desperate people on earth. That you shouldn't be angry with the powerful, but you should be more angry with people even more desperate than yourself. But what did happen as well in the 2010s was the first wave of a new left, from which we do need to learn lessons, because there were so many defeats, but also, I think, foundations were laid. Because in the 2010s, we saw the rise of Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain, the movement around Mélenchon in France, the rise of Corbynism in my own country, the Bernie Sanders movement in the United States. And this was the first wave. Now, you could look at them and feel depressed. Syriza was squashed in government, in practice, by the European Union. Podemos, it had grand initial hopes of forming a government on its own terms. In the end, it's the junior partner in a coalition, which has introduced important policies. Mélenchon didn't become president of France and didn't make it into the second runoff. But in France, the centre-left has been forced to accept its position as the junior partner in the last parliamentary elections, with the radical left as its leader. And if you look at Corbynism, we have Keir Starmer, a deceitful con man who became, I'm a big fan of his, who became leader of the Labour Party, promising nationalisation, taxing the rich, abolishing tuition fees, standing by trade unions and party unity, and literally went back on every single promise he ever made and waged war against the left. But you see, what happened in Britain in 2017, we had an election which everyone wants to erase from history and pretend never happened, because Labour didn't win that election. But what was notable about that election, when Labour did stand for nationalisation and higher taxes on the rich and strong trade unions, a strong welfare state, all of those things, is whilst Labour suffered a terrible defeat in 2015, within the space of 2 years, Labour's vote went from 30% to 40%, the biggest increase in its vote share since 1945. The first time since 1997, Labour had increased its number of seats in Parliament. Labour got swept away in the following years with the culture war that is Brexit. And it showed how toxic culture wars are, because what Corbynism flourished, the way it flourished in 2017, was because of class politics. Its slogan was "for the many, not the few." And that summed up its political prospectus, and it's what attracted so many people to it. But what Brexit did is turn everyone into a Remainer or a Leaver, as though a supermarket worker in East London who voted for Remain had the same interests as the CEO of an investment bank which had done the same, or as if a former miner in the northeast of England somehow had the same interests as Boris Johnson. Of course, it was a complete lie, but it divided Britain down the line of a culture war. You were no longer the many or the few. You were no longer the working class or the elites. You were a Remainer or a Leaver, and that proved toxic for what happened. But whatever the defeat suffered by the left, it is striking in Britain that amongst younger people in particular, and I'm being generous here, saying under 40 because I'm a 38-year-old, but there is a leftish progressive disposition which has not gone away. There's still that mass support for those policies. And if you look at Bernie Sanders, he didn't win the nomination. But the fact that a now octogenarian Jewish senator from Vermont managed to nearly defeat the most powerful political family in the United States itself was a stunning achievement, but mobilized a left which is now stronger in the US than it's ever been. A new generation, again, inspired with the AOC being the most famous, but across national, state level, a new generation of politicians being elected. The center of gravity of the Democratic Party being shifted because of that movement, of that insurgency. Now, it's different. What's happened in Sweden, and I know this is why it's important to not have universal rules about what's happening, but it is striking that in Britain and the United States, there was a study recently by the Financial Times, which is no den of leftiness, it has to be said, but they did a study which showed that millennials were the first generation ever to move to the left with age, that the silent generation, baby boomers, and Generation X had all moved rightwards. And that's including if you take into account home ownership, the minority of homeowners who are millennials have also shifted to the left. Now, I think that's striking because it shows that whatever the defeats have been suffered by the US and the British left, that there is still broad sympathy, a pool of sympathy. And that's because the promises of neoliberalism, that it would provide personal freedom, have proven to be completely false. What we've had instead is insecurity on a mass scale. And insecurity is not freedom. If you don't know what your paycheck will be from week to week, from month to month, if you are struggling, if you lie awake at night panicking about an unopened energy bill, that's not freedom, that's oppression. And that form of oppression defines the lives of millions of people, and that's why there's been this dramatic shift. Now, one of the things, just the final part I wanted to talk about in terms of going on the offensive, is I spoke about how, I suppose what the right have tried to do is to shroud their arguments in the language of personal freedom and of democracy, and to argue that the left represents authoritarianism and assault as well on the rights of the individual. And I think that's something we need to take head on. I think we need to reclaim, or not just reclaim, to put democracy and individual freedom at the heart of what we argue for. Now, there's two examples that I want to just give in terms of, going on the offensive and trying to win the battle of ideas. Now, one example with personal freedom is this demand for a 4-day week, which is becoming increasingly popular in places like Britain, the United States, and in various other European countries. And I think, this was a historic demand of the labor movement to fight for a while for the 8-hour day, for example. And it's fascinating what's happened there, because John Maynard Keynes, the economist in the 1930s, predicted that because of technological advancement, that by now we'd be working on average a 14-hour week, which is not quite panned out, as you've probably noticed. Now, under modern capitalism, of course, we understand work as a means to live. Some might enjoy their work and some others less so. But work is something that the vast majority feel compelled to do in order to subsist, let alone thrive, to pay the costs of being alive, including supporting a family. We've come to accept it as a linchpin of our existence, not just because it directly consumes so much of our time that we have alive, but because it often leaves us feeling tired, because thoughts of work often occupy our thoughts and even our leisure time. We may find it hard to switch off, and in practice, we do so much overtime, often unpaid overtime, or feel compelled to answer emails or take work calls outside of our office hours. When we hear the phrase work-life balance, it's often challenging to even understand where work ends and life begins, because the lines have become so blurred. And I think that's why the idea of a 4-day week is so subversive, because it challenges this specific idea. So one firm in New Zealand did this. They introduced a 4-day week after their boss read on an aeroplane about the idea, so he introduced it, and they found that stress levels amongst their workers fell by 15%, job satisfaction increased, customer engagement went up by nearly a third, and sick days went off. So what happened in Britain is there was a pilot which brought together several organizations and companies where they introduced a 4-day week and then monitored its progress over a period of months. And it was a resounding success. Of the 61 companies and organizations that took part, 56 decided to continue with it. They found that 39% of their employees were less stressed, 71% had reduced levels of burnout at the end of the trial. Likewise, levels of anxiety, fatigue, and sleep issues decreased, while mental and physical health both improved. 60% found an increased ability to combine paid work with care responsibilities and to combine work with social life. And interestingly, the revenue of all of those companies increased as well. The number of staff leaving dropped by 57% over that period. Now, I think that's just one idea that if we champion, it shows our commitment to the idea of personal freedom, to a reduction of the working week with no loss of pay at its core, which is something the labor movement fought for a very long time, but I think as a demand has stalled. But I think that shows, again, how we can put personal freedom at the very core of what we're fighting for, unlike the promises I spoke about before of neoliberalism with personal freedom, which became everything other than that. Now, democracy. This is something I'm very interested in. This idea, we live in a democracy, we're told almost from birth, but we don't live in a democracy, or at least a proper one, something which is kind of a heretical thing for a Westerner to talk about. Because, we are told that we're free citizens, fortunate not to languish under tyranny and despotism like so much of our humanity. But the truth is, most of us hand in our freedoms and liberties on most days of the week, every time we work through our workplace doors. There, we're often at the mercy and whims of those with power who can wield it like autocrats. We don't elect them, and they're not accountable to us. Because they have the power to dismiss us and therefore deprive us of our livelihood if we displease them, we must often surrender our most basic freedoms, from how we speak to how we dress. And because so much of our lives is consumed by work, for much of our life, wherever we are never truly free. Now, saying that the workplace can function like a dictatorship may sound like an exaggeration, but consider the evidence that workers are under strict control over what they say, their social skills, their dress, as I say. Privacy is banished. In the United States, US workers face being regulated for their conduct outside of the workplace. They can be fired by bosses because they disapprove of their forms of recreation, their sexual proclivities, their social media posts. But notice how supportive of unrestrained off-the-leash capitalism often claim that the selling point of this beloved economic system is that it safeguards freedom. So keen on the freedom of the individual, yet nothing to say about the repressive circumstances that define working life for so many. This comes down, I think, to a desperately overdue moment about how we consider the value, the nature of work. So there's been a book published last year which tried to look at how democratic ownership could work. And it argued, reassessing what is a worker, that if those who buy shares are capital investors, then workers should be considered labor investors, and as such, the firm should be democratized with both being able to democratically and equally contribute. That you'd have 2 elected chambers in each firm. The first chamber would be voted on by shareholders on the principle of 1 share, 1 vote. They'd elect a capital investors' House of Representatives. Then the workers, the labor investors, they'd elect their own House of Representatives on the basis of 1 worker, 1 vote. The 2 chambers would then equally elect an executive committee to run each firm. That would decide a whole range of the business's affairs, how to divide up the profits, including how much wages, to the strategy for environmental sustainability. Now, that would be good for the worker for many reasons, a powerful tool to counteract the many abuses that they face in the workplace, from harassment, bullying, unreasonable demands, and unsafe working conditions. Often these abuses are baked into how hierarchy functions. Because as with all autocracies, some kings are tyrannical, others are not. It's the luck of the draw. Others might use that power with benevolence, others not so. But if workers have more of a say, then of course wage inequality is more likely to be confronted. Now, if we look at in the US CEOs were paid 351 times more than their workers in 2020, compared to 61 times in 1989 and just 21 times in 1965. Workers' influence would be a way of redressing that dramatic imbalance. But also there's another example about how the arrogance of this autocratic model within the workplace, how it can actually be fatal. I'll give one example, the tragic example of the Boeing 737 MAX, where engineers made several internal recommendations to improve the new aeroplane model's safety, but they were all dismissed. One engineer lodged a formal complaint and alleged that the Boeing chief executive publicly misrepresented the safety of the plane. Now, there were 2 fatal crashes in 2018 and 2019, which killed 346 people and led to the grounding of the entire global fleet. The company was charged with fraud and had to pay $2.5 billion. Imagine how differently things could have been if workers had been listened to. 2 plane disasters could have been averted, and along with a truly horrendous loss of life, as well as the catastrophic reputational damage caused by Boeing's reckless pursuit of profit. But in workplace autocracies, the people at the top don't want to hear feedback from mere workers, and the point about a democracy is that it forces them to do so. Now, the reason I just gave those 2 examples is because it's a way that we can put democracy and personal freedom at the very heart of a New Left project, to I suppose, repel the idea that the left are authoritarians who are threats to individual freedom, when actually it's capitalism which is the threat to democracy and to personal freedom, which robs us of our autonomy and which robs us of an ability to have a say over our lives, over the lives of our community, and of the lives of our country. Now, just finally, just to finish up, we had a long day. I think it is, what I always end by saying is that, of course, ideas are important to discuss. That's always, we as I've said, as Milton Friedman, not someone you'd necessarily expect me to refer to as a person of authority, but he was right. Of course, it depends on the ideas lying around. And I think now, because of the rise of these left movements in the 2010s, whatever their failures and disappointments, they have put us more in a position where we can think about what sort of society that we want to live in, rather than just being opposed to the excesses of neoliberalism and capitalism. But of course, as those on the left, we believe in struggle. We believe that social change happens from below, and that these ideas are important, but they have to be wedded from those movements. And for me, it's always a reminder, because I'm a political journalist, and my colleagues, the way they look at politics is as a soap opera, as a drama. It's about personalities, who's up, who's down, who stabbed who in the back, that kind of thing. But the reality, of course, of politics is what's happening in society around us. And that's why I try to talk about the reality of the social conditions that those in countries like Britain and America have suffered because of the disaster of the neoliberal experiment. But all the way through history, all the rights and freedoms we've won were done so because of the struggle and sacrifice of those who were often reviled at the time and persecuted. The suffragettes in my own country who were spat at, who were dragged from demonstrations, thrown into dirty cells with tubes forced down their noses. The LGBTQ activists who were spat at in the streets, demonized, hated, reviled. Those who fought for workers' rights, those who fought for the rights of women more broadly, those who fought for the welfare state. We stand on the shoulders of giants. All the rights and freedoms we have, not given to us as acts of generosity, but won because of people's courage and determination. And throughout our history, we can see those for whom the odds seemed stacked against them, and they suffered far worse than we suffer today: torture, imprisonment, and death. But because of their determination and their resilience, that is how we've managed to win so many of the rights and freedoms which are now imperiled, and which sometimes are being taken away with barely a whimper. Today in Britain, the Metropolitan Police in London, recently found to be institutionally homophobic, racist, and misogynistic, dragging peaceful Republican protesters off the streets and throwing them into police cells, emboldened by an assault on the right to protest. So we always have to remember that whatever we debate and we discuss, at the core of what we fight for is that idea of struggle, that with our collective strength, that we can combine together with those who have the same interests and needs as our own, that we don't allow ourselves to be divided by those who try to turn neighbor against neighbor, public sector against private sector worker, those born here against migrants, LGBTQ people against straight people, that instead we build that sense of common purpose, that it is the interests of the majority on a collision course with those at the top, that we never allow ourselves to be presented as the establishment, that we don't allow the populist right to present themselves as the real insurgents, rather as those who are in the service of those at the top who want to turn us against each other to ensure that the elites prosper. So let's have the same determination and resilience and imagination that our ancestors had as they fought for a different sort of world. And that is how we will build a different society. We will tear neoliberalism down and build a world based on our needs and our aspirations rather than the needs of profit for a tiny elite. Thank you.
Stay. Hello. Thank you so much.